Well, as Phil mentioned, we are heading to Corinth this morning. It was almost 20 years ago when Pam and I headed to Corinth for the first time, only time so far that we've been to Corinth. And here we are standing in the old city center of that great city of Corinth. And so this morning, just a bit of introduction to this city, because we have been for several weeks in Athens with Paul, and now he has turned from the great philosophical center of the ancient world, that great city that just held such eminent position as the theological capital, the philosophical capital of the ancient world. And now Paul is going to go to one of the commercial centers of the ancient world. There are not many large cities in the ancient world, not many that had hundreds of thousands of people. Rome, of course, the great leading city. Athens itself, relatively small compared to Corinth, and then Ephesus, where we're going to see Paul going over the next weeks and months. And so Paul is heading to the great city of Corinth, which has perhaps at this time nearly 750,000 people. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands. I mentioned it's a commercial center because of where it sits right between two great seas, and it's an area where they actually built canals and then rolling passageways where small ships and certainly cargo from all ships could be carried across a short little isthmus of land and cut off hundreds of miles of perilous sea journey. But more than that, you need to know that Corinth, because it's on the sea and because of its great ports, has become the city where sailors and travelers and commercial agents from around the world have come. And it could be said of that day that what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. Corinth is that city unlike anything we know today. Perhaps we could talk about Las Vegas being that city, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. No, it doesn't actually. It goes back home with you. You just don't talk about it much, but the effects still linger. Corinth was that city where, can you imagine the tens of thousands of sailors from around the world coming to a city and staying there just a few days or a few weeks? It was a city that was full of moral decadence. In fact, there is a verb in the ancient Greek language called to Corinthize. If you Corinthized yourself, everyone knew what that meant. You were acting completely immorally. You were acting as one who does not care about consequences. It had that reputation throughout the world. The word for a woman of Corinth, a Corinthithetes, was synonymous with the word for prostitute, because the city was so well known for its prostitution, its gambling, its alcoholism, its immorality. We could talk about certain cities around the world today that are known as gambling centers or centers of immorality. I don't think any of them could compare to the way that Corinth operated in the first century. So we go into this ancient city. Here's the ancient marketplace. We're going to find out this would be exactly where Paul would have lived and worked. He's going to spend 18 months at least in Corinth. And here's the old city center where the shops and the stalls and the tent makers would have been, the things that took place in the city. Pam and I stood on a portion of the old Lectyon Road. It's amazing how well preserved so much of that road is. And of course, the buildings all collapse around it, but it gives you this sense of just the greatness of Corinth in its day. And above all of that, I mean literally above all of that, just back to the right, you can see there's a large hill that's rising above the city. The top of that massive hill, there was the walled city of Corinth. Down below was the common city, and it's close to the port. It's at sea level. But rising nearly 2,000 feet behind the city is this great mountain that becomes the upper city, the Acrocorinth. That's the fortress. That's the walled city. That's the impenetrable keep that they would retreat to if they ever were under attack or siege. And as you begin to ascend this hill, it reminded me of this scene straight out of Lord of the Rings, if you're familiar with that, Minas Tirith, this great walled city in the keep, in part based on the actual city of the Acrocorinth, because as you ascend the hill, there's wall after wall and tower after tower and turret after turret, defenses that were built up over the years and the decades and the centuries. We just continue to ascend. I mean, these are real pictures of what still remains of that Acrocorinth, and you can imagine an army trying to march straight up this hill and attack the city. So this also becomes a place where the Corinthians put what is most valuable to them. What they most treasure, they're going to keep here safely tucked away. And that to them is the temple of Aphrodite, or the temple of Venus, depending on whether you're using the Latin or the Greek name. You know, that great goddess of love, that great goddess of sexuality that Corinth treasured so very much. Her temple is going to have 1,000 priestesses working at any time. During the day, they work at the temple, they honor their goddess. And every evening they descend the hill and they work as prostitutes in and among the streets of Corinth. It's part of their religious duty. It's part of the religion of the goddess of Aphrodite and Venus, who was treasured so highly amongst the Corinthian people. So can you imagine 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul walking into a city like this, a city that is so known for its immorality and its decadence? You approach the top of the hill, you go through tower after tower, gate after gate, and as we ascended, getting higher and higher, and the sloped stone and the walls, you realize this is what the city treasures. This is what the city has protected, gate after gate. And you notice even if you can see those small little rectangular holes in the side of the wall, it's where you would have men with bows and arrows or javelins or other things standing guard. It's just an amazing place to be. And Paul walks into this city armed with the gospel of Christ. We stood atop the Acrocorinth. You can see it's taller than One World Trade Center in New York, the tallest building in the U.S. now, by several hundred feet. It just towers over the great city. I did have to force Pam to get that close to take this one picture with me, and she very quickly retreated as I stood there and looked over the edge. I don't know if Paul went up there. I don't know if he visited the temple. There were several things in his letter to the Corinthians that seem to suggest he became familiar with the ins and outs and some of the practices of the temple worship there, as he writes how to live in light of this darkness, how to live in light of the evil that surrounds the city. And so we come to Corinth, an amazing city in the ancient world, a unique city. And we find out that Paul is once again on the road. So here we go, on the road again, Acts 18, 1 through 3. If you haven't gotten out your Bible text yet, you can this morning to Acts 18. We're going to just start into the first couple of verses, kind of by way of introduction, find out about Paul's ministry and the way he goes in to Corinth. Remember, he's just left Athens. He's just come down the road a ways. And in Athens, he had that great debate there on the hill of Mars, or the Areopagus. He's talked to the great council. And his message, though in a culture in a way they could understand, his message was, there is a day of judgment coming. There is a day when this world ends. There is an appointed time with an appointed judge. It's an appointed day that will happen, and we're heading towards that day. I don't think it's any accident that Luke gives us that teaching, that preaching as the capstone of Athens, and then Paul goes down the road to Corinth. And I think the reader is supposed to understand, still with that view in mind. Let us not forget, Paul has just said, judgment is coming on the world. That day of judgment is coming. And he tells the Athenians, and some believe, and he grounds them in their discipleship, and then he moves again to the next city. And it's on now to the great commercial capital of the world in Acts 18, 1 through 3, with this sense that there is a day of judgment coming, and people need to know it. People need to know what this life is about. They need to know where they're heading. And the people of Corinth certainly needed to know. So Paul goes down the road, verse 1 of Acts 18. After these events, Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them. And they worked together, for they were tent makers by trade. Luke, as is typical of his writing, packs a lot into 3 small verses, and it's good for us to have a little bit of context and understanding of what's going on. And so you got a little space there in your notes if you want to jot down any of these things about going into Corinth, that it says, Paul, upon arriving in Corinth, he's on his own now. Remember, he was left in Athens alone. He sent Timothy and Silas back to check on the church in Thessalonica and to check on the churches that had been planted and believers that were there because of the intensive persecution. Why didn't Paul go back? He's not allowed back in Thessalonica. The day he sets foot back in Thessalonica, he'll be arrested and tried for treason against the decrees of Caesar. We saw that when he was in Thessalonica. So he, on his own, goes into this massive, overwhelming city of Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila. Luke does not say he found a fellow Jewish believer. He does not say he found a fellow Jewish disciple of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We get the sense, and it seems to become pretty clear here, that Paul runs across Aquila, who happens to also be someone who makes tents. He works with tents, with probably leather, other material, sewing tents, dwelling places, repairing tents, working on people's leather or things made of that Cilician goat hair, or we're not sure exactly the materials, probably a variety of them. This is what they do. And Paul comes across him probably seeing his little stall in the marketplace or the shop that Aquila has set up. And then Paul discovers that he's Jewish, not a believer in Jesus Christ yet. And so Paul falls in with this fellow Jew, Aquila, who had been born in Pontus, but had come with his wife Priscilla from Italy, from the city of Rome, where they've been living and evidently working. That was their commercial business. And it tells us here in the passage that they had come from Rome because Claudius had commanded the Jews to leave Rome. Well, who's Claudius? This is Emperor Claudius, the emperor of the great Roman Empire, who ruled for about 15 years during this time. Now, you'd expect, if Luke is writing about an edict from the emperor, that we would know something about this edict, and you would be absolutely correct. Suetonius, the historian, writes that in about 51 AD, Emperor Claudius was tired of the turmoil that was going on in his city. And much of this turmoil, according to Suetonius, was from a group of Jews who were following Christus. And Christus probably refers to Christ. Most scholars think that. Now, some have alleged there's another religious leader amongst the Jews whose name was Christus, and that's not Jesus Christ, it's another. Whatever the situation, there is a disturbance among the Jewish people living in Rome. Rome is a city of well over 1 million, probably 1.2 million people, and probably 100,000 Jews living in the city. A number of Jewish people lived and worked there in the imperial city. And there was a disturbance among the Jewish people in Rome. What's this disturbance? It's a religious disturbance. And more than likely, it's because some of these Jews are now following Jesus Christ as Messiah. And in the synagogues, they're discussing Christ as Messiah. The same kind of ministry that Paul has, synagogue to synagogue. These discussions are happening, and there's a division growing amongst the Jewish population in Rome. There are those who are following Christ, and those who are continuing in the old ways of the law. And that division is becoming problematic, because you've got Orthodox Jews who are persecuting and rejecting the new Christian Jews. And in Rome, we find out, in the later letter of Romans, you have Christian Jews and Gentile Christians in Rome who are rejecting the old Orthodox Jews. And this division becomes quite serious. It's the reason Paul writes the letter to the Romans some years later, because of the great division that's happening amongst the people there. And so there's racial segregation and there's religious segregation. It's disturbing the well-being of the whole city. It's a pretty big deal. So the emperor himself puts into law an edict. He kicks all of the Jewish people, anyone of Jewish blood, he kicks them all out of the city of Rome. Says you can no longer live here, practice here, work here, have commercial trade here, instantly. Well, this creates a series of refugees who left the city. So Luke describes this. He just gives reference to the Edict of Claudius, where he commanded the Jews to leave Rome. Everyone in the ancient world knew about it. And that's how we also kind of know the date. We say, okay, how long was Paul in Thessalonica and then Athens? Now we know that it's 51 AD. We know the year, we know the time. It's just happened recently. So the Jews have been expelled from Rome, and Aquila and Priscilla were part of that mass of refugees who've now immigrated to other cities in the empire. And we find them probably not believers in Jesus Christ, but Jewish people who are living in Corinth, working in Corinth. Paul comes to them, and it doesn't say because they were believers or because they were the same faith, but because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them. And they worked together. They were tent makers. Now we've seen in other cities that Paul worked, and he'll tell the Thessalonians in his first letter, chapter 2, he'll remind them how day and night I worked tirelessly when I was among you. Not just working for the gospel, but no, I literally worked night and day to meet my own needs and take care of my physical needs so that I could minister to you. This is Paul's occupation. We're not sure just when he learned it, maybe growing up in Tarsus, maybe during those years in the desert in Arabia where he was just being ministered to and taught and discipled by the Holy Spirit. We're not exactly sure, but he seems to be a tent maker quite literally. So these verses give us an introduction to what is Paul's life like. Look at this journey. Can we just go, wow, he's the great apostle. What does that actually look like in day-to-day ministry? It means he goes from city to city, and he's working hard, and he's doing what he can to share the gospel. So going into Corinth, it's also good for us to get this perspective of what Paul says about the time when he first entered Corinth. Living with Aquila and Priscilla, making tents to take care of his physical needs. He doesn't have anyone else around to support him. His close companions he's sent back to Thessalonica. He has no idea if they're coming back, knowing the grave difficulty of the persecution there. And if they do come back, he doesn't know when they're going to come back. He's left to take care of himself completely and utterly on his own. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he reminds the Corinthians of how he first came to the city. If you turn there, look what he says in 1 Corinthians 2. When I came to you, brothers and sisters. In other words, Acts 18, verse 1. When I came to you, I didn't come as someone superior in speaking ability or wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony of God. Now the Corinthians loved good speakers. Corinthians were a very proud people. Not only are they a commercial center, but they also host the Isthmian Games. These are bigger than the Olympic Games. Every 2 years they hosted this massive festival of sporting games and competitions. These aren't gladiatorial type combat. This is running and jumping and wrestling and all those things we still kind of associate with Olympic sports. They hosted the world's biggest games every 2 years. And they were a proud people. They were a proud city. And along with the great commercial interest and the athletic interest that drew the world's attention, they loved good speakers. They loved public oratory. They loved those who could stand and eloquently address crowds, as you can imagine with these massive games and festivals in town all the time. Those who could entertain at the theater, those who could speak so well and so eloquently. Paul says, I wasn't like them. I wasn't gifted like they're gifted. When I came to speak to you about the testimony of God, I wasn't superior in speaking ability. I didn't come like these others that have come and entertained you with their words. I determined ahead of time to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified, Him disgraced, Him humiliated. Oh, this is scandalous. They were in a culture that wanted people to be strong. They wanted people to be bold. They wanted people to have great political power and judicial ability. Not unlike today, right? Oh, some of us love the current president. He's so bold. He says what he thinks. He just declares it. He tells it like it is. He tells people the way things ought to be. And we just love the fact that he just gets in people's face, and we kind of glom to that kind of political leader. Just straightforward truth and hard hitting and raw in their face kind of. I love the way he digs at them and whatever side of the aisle you're on, you tend to love and then I love this guy who gives it right back to them. Oh, they have these debates and that's the way the Corinthians were. They loved to just have these intensive displays of great debating prowess, and they just flocked to people like that. They wanted their religion to be like that. They wanted their religion to be so strong and powerful. And Paul says, I preach about Jesus, and he was disgraced, humiliated. Notice he doesn't even emphasize, I came to tell you about the powerful resurrection of the great God and Savior. Of course, that's part of his message. Of course, he'll reveal that in 1 Corinthians 15 when he talks about the message he preached to them. The resurrection was there, but this mindset he's giving is a reminder that the cross is a stumbling block to pride of all kinds. And here's the Corinthians, this proud, boastful people. No one can overtake us. Look at our accurate Corinth. No army has ever successfully sacked the city of Corinth. Why? We had this impenetrable forces, and we're so incredibly powerful and strong and skilled and wise. And Paul came preaching a message of humility. I preach Christ and him crucified, a scandalous message. And I was with you in weakness and in fear. And in great trembling I came. My message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom like you're used to, but in demonstration of the power of the Spirit, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of mankind, but that your faith would rest on the power of God. That's how Paul came to Corinth, weak, trembling, and in fear. That's his testimony. I came to Corinth in fear. You're like, no, wait a minute. So I thought these questions during the week. Paul came to Corinth fearfully, trembling, and weak. Do I believe the Bible to be true? I phrased it for you in the notes, so just really, I had to ponder this. Do I believe the Bible to be true? Well, of course you do. It's the Holy inspired Word of God. It's God-breathed. It's perfect. Do I believe these verses in 1 Corinthians 2 to be true? Do I believe Paul's testimony here? Because this is not how I picture Paul. This is not how I imagine Paul going city to city. I imagine him going into Corinth he's just come off this incredible debate in Athens where he stood toe to toe with the greatest philosophers of world history. And he gave it to them. And he told them about the judgment day that's coming, and he crafted his speech so amazingly well. And now he's going to go into Corinth, and he's going to understand their culture, and he's going to give them this amazing view of the gospel. I came in weakness and fear and great trembling, not with persuasive words of wisdom. I'll tell you honestly how I kind of go, oh, not Paul. He's just so humble. Amongst all of his other incredible qualities, he is just so humble. That's part of what makes him such an awesome, amazing guy, right? Oh, and it's almost, and listen, I've been around, you really want to follow fangirls of Paul, get around some European theologians, especially those in Eastern Europe who come through persecution. Paul is a god to them, small g, but just barely. I mean, there are some who like, Paul, you dare not say anything negative about the Apostle Paul. You dare not paint him in any kind of picture that's less than just glorious. Like, oh, he's so dreamy. Paul says, I came in fear and trembling. And if the word of God is true, then these verses are true. And Paul means, I came in weakness and fear and trembling. Not in persuasive words of wisdom. We kind of like the persuasive words of wisdom, don't we? We don't want we don't want preachers who preach in fear and trembling. I don't listen to many like that. I like listening to Tony Evans. I like listening to Alistair Begg. And even when he's like humble and quiet, he's still so powerful. I like Charles Swindoll. I like Chuck Steele. And I like those who are just, they're so good. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I also just wonder sometimes, can we get this image of what sharing the gospel is really like sometimes? That it happens in fear? That it happens in trembling? It doesn't have to have all the persuasive words of wisdom? Because sometimes in idolizing the great Apostle Paul and others so much, we can't approach that. You can't be Paul, can you? Oh, I can't share the gospel like he did. I can't do it. I can't talk to people like he did. I can't have the ministry he had. Of course, you're not called to have his ministry. But can you share the gospel in weakness and trembling and fear and without words of wisdom? I think you can. And so it does well for us to pause and understand just what this ministry was actually like. What did Paul do? Well, he shared the gospel. I came to you in weakness and fear and trembling. My message wasn't in persuasive words of wisdom, but I did have a message, and that message demonstrated the Spirit and power, so that your faith doesn't rest on my wisdom and my great skill at apologetics and my ability to know everything Ravi Zacharias ever taught and did, and everything that any great apologist has ever written, and I memorized More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, and I got all the facts. No, let the power be of God. Let him use a weak vessel to demonstrate his power and ability. Paul shared the gospel. With who? Clearly with those he lived with. A Jew named Aquila and his wife Priscilla. He shared the gospel with them. How do we know this? Because they become believers. And we're going to see that throughout passages that follow. They become leaders in the church. And they disciple others. And they go out to Ephesus. And they disciple Apollos there and make him a great leader in the church. And Paul's going to write to them when they're in Rome later. And says, oh, greet Aquila and Priscilla, my good friends. So they're going to become believers. So what? He shared the gospel with those he lived with, and he shared the gospel with those he worked with. We've seen it before, right? But let's get back to, this is not a man in white robes standing on a pedestal in the marketplace. This is a man who shared the good news of Jesus with those he lived with and those he worked with. And he's quite literally the first tent maker and missionary. Have you heard that phrase before? Oh, tent making. This is literally where it comes from. Paul took care of his own physical needs. He worked in the city of Corinth so that he could share the gospel with those he lived with, those he worked with, those he came to the marketplace. And if you've ever heard that phrase, what is tent making missionary? Today it can take a couple different forms. But basically, someone who goes as a missionary, maybe it doesn't say missionary on the visa. Maybe it doesn't say they're going as an agricultural worker, as a school teacher, as an oil rig worker in the Middle East. They're going to a country. Their purpose is to share the gospel, but they're going to work. And maybe that job actually supports them economically and meets their needs. Or maybe it's a way for them to get in a country that's otherwise closed to missionaries. This is where the phrase comes from. Paul went to Corinth to share the gospel of Christ, but he did it making tents. How did he live? Have you ever thought of this? This guy is traveling town to town to town to town to town, and at least some of the time he's living in a tent. Have you ever thought that thought before? I mean, what does he do as a business? He makes tents. Where do you think he lives? A really nice apartment? Tent makers are not like way up there in the social scale. Now, Aquila and Priscilla, they've traveled a lot. They might run a shop where they actually employ people like Paul. Maybe they live in a nicer house. Have you thought that much of the time Paul is actually living in one of the tents that he makes? How do you make tents? Oh, there's ways to work on leather. You need some tools for it. Paul is very likely traveling with a tool bag. You ever thought that thought? Sit and ponder the scriptures. He's traveling with some tools to work on tents and to work on fabric and other things and to make things. And part of the time he's living in a tent. He talks about the way he lived in some places. Later in 1 Corinthians 9, you can look that up. 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 9. Here's how Paul says it to Corinthians later. Did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you could be exalted? Because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge? You weren't supporting me when I came to town. I robbed other churches by taking wages from them to serve you. When I was present with you and in need, when I was present with you, Acts 18 goes into Corinth, and I was in need. Paul is seemingly financially pretty destitute at this point. I wasn't a burden to anyone. Why? Because I made tents for a while. That's how I supported my every physical need. Until, we'll find this out from Acts 18 also, until Timothy and Silas come back from Thessalonica and they actually have gifts for the church, from the church. Then he can devote himself full time. When the brothers came from Macedonia, then they fully supplied my need. But in everything, I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. He didn't come like some of the roving philosophers of the day who demanded payment for their wisdom. He came humbly and here, and he met his own needs, and worked on tents, lived in tents. 1 Thessalonians 2, 9 through 10, I've already referenced Paul saying, remember how I came to you working tirelessly night and day so as not to be a burden to any of you. Romans 16, 3 and 4, Paul will mention Aquila and Priscilla. I lived with them, I made tents with them. And then he'll say this, they risked their necks for me. Literally, they put their lives on the line for me. All the things that are going to happen in the city of Corinth. These two become believers, and then they take care of Paul, and they stand up for Paul. This is how Paul lived town to town. Talk about on the road again. He's not going in greatness. He's not going in just these images we kind of have of him in power and majesty and great. He's going to a regular job, and he's sharing Jesus with the people he works with. And he's going to the community center and sharing Jesus with the people he works out with. That kind of imagery. Not standing in the great forums and declaring the wise things of God. Well, that'll happen when he's on trial sometimes. But the day-to-day of the sharing the gospel is very accessible, very approachable. And along with it, constantly rejected, abused, arrested, beaten, left for dead. He's going to be at trial again here in Corinth before long. In chapter 18, he's going to be brought before the proconsul of Galilee on all kinds of charges against him. The Jews are going to find him and persecute him again. I think Luke wants us to ask why. Why would Paul do this? I mean, people were believing in Athens, even some of the members of the Areopagus themselves. Why would he leave that success and go down the road to another city in fear and trembling? Why would he do this? Earlier, we had read Acts 20, 18 through 27. Paul says, I count nothing of gain or interest. The only thing that matters is that I share the gospel. That's what I've been called to do. That's what God has sent me to do. That's my purpose, to share Christ and Him crucified. It drives him. It drove him in Athens. He saw the city full of idols. He saw the way people were living. He said, this breaks my heart. It tears me up. They need Christ. Paul had the proper perspective that this world was not his home. There is a healthy dose of perspective that we need, each one of us. This world is not our home. First Peter, we're told that we are aliens and strangers in this world. Now, you know the way that you feel about illegal aliens. You know the way that you feel about immigration. You know the way that you feel about people who live here and they take up resources. Folks, that's us in this world. We're aliens and strangers here. This is not our home. We don't belong here. We don't belong to this world system. We need some of that perspective in our own lives. There's a lot of songs, some from the olden days that I still remember growing up. I can't be at home in this world anymore. Oh, Lord, you know, I can't depend on you. Heaven's not my home. Oh, Lord, what will I do? I grew up in Texas. You got to remember that, right? I got a mansion just over the hilltop. How many of y'all sang that one eons ago, right? A little silver, a little gold. But I got that mansion over the hilltop. That's perspective, folks. I can live like I'm living now because I know what's coming. We sang a song earlier, because he lives, because I know he holds the future. And then there's that great hymn, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, what? All here is gone. Because I know he holds the future. That's perspective. That's part of why we gather together week after week, to remind each other that's what's coming. What did Paul just say in Athens? There's a day of judgment coming. He holds the future. Everything is going to end. All this stuff, all the things you might live for. And to the Athenians, he's like, all the things you worship, all the things you live for, they're all wrong. They're all the wrong perspective. They're not going to do anything for you. To the Christian, we say, keep the proper perspective. All this is going to end, especially the difficulties, the pain, the struggles, that's all going to end. It's just a short time until we get home. Yeah, we're aliens and strangers here. Sometimes you feel like an alien and a stranger. You feel like this world just isn't your home. You just look around or you look at your own life and difficulties and struggles. You go, oh, when's it going to end? It's going to. It's going to end. And it's going to be amazing when it does. Let's remind and encourage one another. It's coming to an end. Paul had this perspective long before he stepped out into public ministry. 2 Corinthians 12, again to the Corinthian people. There's so much that we see in the letters that reflects on how he lived while he was here. He reminds them later who he was, why he did what he did. 2 Corinthians 12 is when he's talking about his own life and his own calling to ministry. And he says this, oh, boasting? Okay, they want to boast. He's kind of arguing with the church. He's having a rough time with the church in Corinth. This is like his fourth letter to them. We only have two of them that God reserved as inspired word. But he's writing back and forth with them. He goes, oh, you want to boast? You want to boast in people? You want to talk about your great speakers and leaders? Okay, it's not beneficial, but I'll go on a little boasting here. Let me boast about visions and revelations I've had. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, this again, it sets up some of the timing for us, understanding. Whether in the body, I do not know, or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. Paul had some kind of experience, some kind of, was it a vision? Was he actually metaphysically taken somewhere else? I don't know, but I was caught up to the third heavens. How many heavens are there? There's 7 heavens, 3 heavens. There's stuff we don't understand, but Paul said, listen, I was caught up to a level of heaven. I was taken up to the heavens. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I don't know. God knows. Now, some would say, this happened after Paul had been stoned. And I'm like, it sounds like a guy who's been stoned. I used to think that as a college. I don't know, in the body, out of the body. Some would say, no, this was like a vision he had when he was wounded and almost dying. I don't know. I don't think so. He said 14 years. It seems like God gave him this special revelation, this special insight, because he knew he was going to need it. This man, I was caught up into paradise. I was there. I got a glimpse of it. And I heard stuff I can't even tell you. I heard inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. I just can't even. On behalf of this man, I will boast. What God did to me, I saw where I'm going. I saw where I'm going to be. And I got to experience it. And maybe physically I was literally there. Maybe it was a vision, a revelation. I don't know exactly. But I saw where I'm going. And I saw what it's going to be like. And I'd tell you about it, but there's just no words for the glory and the greatness of what's coming. It's inexpressible. Joy inexpressible and full of glory. I mean, literally, I can't even. And Paul has this perspective of where he's going and what's coming. Paul knows there's a day of judgment coming, and when we get to that day, it's glory for us. But the world needs to know it's coming. He says, I was caught up into paradise. And literally, the Greek word paradisus, what is that? It's a park-like place of future happiness. It's the ideal. And it has these images of a restored, unblemished Garden of Eden, where God walked among us and it was perfect and there was no sin and everything was created for us. It's a dwelling place of God where there will be fellowship and joy and life will be completely undisturbed by sin. Now, I know some people think of heaven and they're kind of like Gary Larson, the Far Side cartoon. Just a guy up with wings on a cloud. And he's like, you might not read this. I wish I'd brought a magazine. Why? Because it's like, there's just nothing to do here. It's just like, we're just flying around and maybe we'll have little harps and sing little hymns or something. So people have these images of heaven like it's just going to be, actually, we kind of dread it. Well, it's going to be so boring. It doesn't sound like we're going to be gathered around a throne singing praises 24/7. To some of you, that does not sound like heaven. I like this picture a little more from Max Lucado, part of his What Makes Heaven Heavenly. You will be at your best forever. Even now you have good moments. You display traces of saintliness. It's those other moments that sour life, right? And he'll talk about the sharp tongue and the bitter words and the way you hurt others. That part wearies you. But God's going to impound all imperfections at his gate. Pause. Let this promise drench you. Can you envision your sinless existence? Christ will have completed his redemptive work. He will suction the last drop of orneriness from the most remote corner of your soul. Some of y'all go, that's going to take a powerful vacuum, right? Definitely for me. Can you imagine never weary, never selfish, never defeated? Clear mind, tireless muscles, unhindered joy. Heaven's a perfect place of perfected people with our perfect Lord. And everybody else is going to be at their best also. Everyone else is going to be completely cleansed, completely purified, completely sanctified, utter and total and complete, perfect with God. And we'll have responsibilities, and we'll have roles. We'll have things to do, and it's going to be glorious. Paul got to go there. Paul saw it. Paul understood. Why is he going town to town and living in tents or wherever else he can stay, and sometimes in a house with somebody, and the church will start and somebody takes him in. But still, he's living off of others, and he's doing this town after town for years. Why would you do that? Because he knows where he's going, and he knows what he's been called to do along the way. What do we do with this morning? First of all, you're not called to be the Apostle Paul. You don't have to live like he lived. You don't have to try to do what he did. That's not what you're called to. How many people in this room are called to be Apostle Paul? None. How many people are called to be Phil O'Day? One. Phil O'Day. How many of you are called to be a Dan Hubyar? Only one of you. Dan Hubyar. And the other people are not the same. How many of you are called to be Faith Nelson? Only one of you. How many of you are called to be Daniel Brown? Okay, that's a trick question. There's actually two of us. You're called to be you. You have a stewardship. You have giftings. You're not supposed to be like Paul. If you're like, well, I can't share Christ. Why? Because I think of the Apostle Paul. Don't think of him. You can see some of the same motivations. You're called to be you. How many are called to be Leanna Esri? But that embarrassed her, so I won't do it, right? She's like, oh, don't talk about me. You're just called to be you. Be a stewardship of what God's called you to do. And part of your calling is sharing the gospel with those that you live with. You said Paul shared the gospel with those he lived with. Well, who do you live with? You go, I live by myself. Okay, who's in your home? Or who's in your neighborhood? Who do you live near? Who's around you? Who's your neighbor? Some of you live in apartment buildings or other buildings with lots of people around you. Some of you live in a home by yourself. You still have some neighbors. Paul shared the gospel with those he worked with. Who do you work with? God called you to be you, and he put you in the place where you work to be light in that area of darkness. And some say, well, I'm retired now. Okay, who do you work out with? Who do you do whatever hobby with? Do you get together with other people to do something with? Are there family members that live close or that you can minister to? Who are you called to share the gospel with? We're all called. Not like Paul, didn't have to look like that, but I've been urging now for weeks, who might God be calling you to share the gospel with? Pray for opportunities. Pray that God opens their heart. You have some names? Have you developed a short list? People around you, people in your family, people in your neighborhood, people you associate with. Do you have a list of people you're praying for? God, give an open door for the gospel. Open the door of their heart. Oh, and maybe you feel like Paul. Oh, I'm in fear. I'm in trembling. I don't know great words of wisdom to share. God's not calling you to share great words of wisdom. He's calling you to let the Spirit work in you. Be a faithful steward. So you say, well, how can I do that? Should I invite them to church? That's not a bad idea. But here's the reality. Some would say, but they don't know God at all. If they came to Sunday school, they'd be like, they don't even understand the stuff we're talking about. Can I start us on a path to get some vision for how we're going to share the gospel as a church? Can we just cast some vision and start thinking about things we could do? What if we had opportunities that not only serve you as the church and the members, which we must do, that's what we're called to do. We're not going to make our church service an evangelistic outreach. The church service is for the believers, to build you up, to strengthen you, to encourage you week by week. That's why the church is called to gather week by week. But what if in some of our weekly gatherings we also have fishing pools? We're called to be fishers of men. Some of you are like, I don't have a place to go fishing for men. I don't really interact with other unbelievers. Or I don't know a natural place where I can share the gospel with them, where they can hear the gospel. I don't have any fishing pools to go fishing in. What if we had some? Could you imagine an intentional place for inviting friends, neighbors, and coworkers? You say, well, I don't know that our morning service is the right place for that. Maybe not. We're going to share the gospel in morning services, but it is to build up the believers week by week. Can you imagine Sundays at 9:15 in the morning telling a friend, hey, would you come to Sunday school with me? That might not be the ideal. But we're like, hey, we're doing an 8-week workshop on Sunday mornings before our church service. You don't have to come to the church service, but we're going to do an 8-week workshop on doing life with your adult children. How many of you are doing life with your adult children now? Let me see. Yeah, the great majority of people in the church right now. I know some of you are the adult children. That's okay. How many of you know other people who are trying to do life with their adult children? Like you're in that phase of life and friends and neighbors and others are in the same phase of life? What if we had an option on Sunday morning for, hey, we're going to have another class. It's a workshop. I'm not even going to call it church. It's a workshop, and it's for the members, for us to learn these things, Christian authors, Christian curriculum. A workshop on doing life with your adult children. Pam and I think I told you we've been kind of listening to this audiobook on doing life with our adult children because we got 2 of them now. Here are just some quotes. See if this would be of interest to people around you that you know. Every child needs at least one significant adult who's irrationally positive about them. That's why grandparents are sometimes a kid's favorite, because they can just be irrationally positive. Are you irrationally positive with your kids? Oh, that gets hard, doesn't it? But you don't know what a mess they are. Okay. How about words don't always lead to connection, but enjoyable connections can lead to words. There's just wisdom that men and women of faith have learned about dealing with their adult kids. What are areas you can connect with your kids? Not start with words, but start with great experiences that lead to. Withholding advice goes against our nature as parents, but unsolicited advice, even if it's good advice, is usually taken as criticism. Man, I need that on the bathroom mirror and on the car and everywhere. I think I have pretty good advice. If it's unsolicited, it sounds like criticism to my kids. Independence is the goal. This means your adult children take full responsibility for their finances, actions, relationships, and growth and development. That's what I got to remember. That's what we're working towards, right? That's going to help my decision. Do you think you have coworkers or friends or neighbors who could benefit from this wisdom about this phase of parenting in their life with adult kids? Here's just a couple of things that some of this curriculum deals with. What's the difference between enabling and helping? Have you asked that question? Do you continue to ask that question? There's some wisdom. What boundaries should I have if my child moves back home? I heard that laughter. How can I support my grown children when I do not support their values? This is real stuff that we as Christians need answers to. And I think it's also the kind of stuff that the world is looking for answers to, because they're dealing with the same kind of issues and they don't have a lot of resources to deal with it. They don't have the faith to turn back to that you and I do. But this might be a way we can lead some there. Folks, I'm just kind of vision casting here. There are things out there like caring for your aging parents. My goodness, how many of us are there? How many of us have a parent in hospice right now? At least a couple that I know of. How many are helping make financial decisions, medical decisions for aging parents? You're going through those things of grief and loss. How many of your friends and neighbors are dealing with the same stuff and they need a resource? They need hope. Intentional grandparenting, money management, marriage enrichment. There's so many things that we could say, you know what, we need to learn that too. And we could do something intentionally to invite others. And midweek or during the week, we could have, they're Bible study. They're things that are building up believers, but also they're great places to invite others. Intentionality in sharing the gospel. We don't need to think like Paul, act like Paul, do what Paul did, because we're not called to be the Apostle Paul. There's principles and there's modeling here. What are we called to do and to be? How are we called to minister individually and as a church to the lost around us? God wants us to have a vision for reaching the lost, a passion for reaching the lost. And part of our discipleship is figuring out, how do we share Christ with those we live with, those we work with? This morning, let's just take a few more minutes, thank you for your patience, to remind ourselves what Christ has done for us. Why we live like we live, because of the future he has secured for us on the cross. Worship team's going to come. Others are going to come to help us minister communion this morning. Can you just during this time be so thankful for what God has done? We've just seen there's a day of judgment coming. We need to share that message with others. Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed,